So, first of all, anyway, it's a pleasure to be with you, Imam Rashied, and to be able to recall wonderful memories from Cape Town, even if they were difficult times in the broader South African context, for which I owe so much, because it's as a result of my involvement in interfaith relations here that my whole vocation of my life in this field has grown and expanded to the degree it has. But you asked me to start with some comments about my own personal background. So, as people can tell from my accent, I was born and raised in England for the first 15 years of my life. And I then went after high school to advance my religious studies in Jerusalem. And I had my rabbinic ordination actually from the heart of ultra-Orthodoxy. If there's such a thing that we can talk of as Wahhabi Judaism, it's probably the ultra-Orthodox world. So I come out of that milieu, even though I didn't come from a home like that. But I wanted to study as much as I could in as little time as possible. And if you go to a place where they have no other interest purely than studying the scriptural sources and jurisprudence and commentaries, you will study more you will learn more in a shorter period of time there. At any rate, my wife and I came out as a newly married young couple to South Africa. We came out initially to Johannesburg as student advisors to work with the Jewish student groups, and we were only coming out for 1 to 2 years. I was fascinated by South Africa. I was particularly fascinated by South African Jewry. Why? Because I grew up in a home in England that was actually very politically aware. My father was a famous rabbi, a modern Orthodox rabbi, who believed a religion that does not relate to the issues around it is not worthy of the name. And therefore it was a very politically aware home. And in what one might call the naivety of the 1950s, our home meticulously observed the boycott on South African goods. Outspanned marriages were prohibited and so on and so forth. And yet my father, who had been really a pioneer of Jewish education in the modern world, had been invited out to South Africa many times and had come many times, and in fact had started the Jewish educational movement here. At the King David School in Johannesburg, there's a little plaque that records the first establishment of a Jewish day school in South Africa, and others came out from that he was behind, or that he played a seminal role in establishing. And he used to speak of South African Jewry with a love and a warmth and an affection that was incomparable to any other Jewish community he had met. So I grew up fascinated by this dilemma. How do you have such a wonderful Jewish community in such a diabolical political context? And when I was offered the opportunity of coming out for just 1 to 2 years to work with students, it was really exciting because I was really fascinated by this dilemma and wanted to see it for myself and what were the ramifications. So, as I say, as newlyweds, my wife Sharon and I, we came out to Johannesburg. And I would move around the different campuses working with Jewish student organizations, but by naturally, if you like, as a matter of course, I would speak with the communities at large, I would give sermons in different synagogues. So if you like, became known to a degree, to the point that, again, to cut a long story short, when the Sea Point Hebrew congregation, Marea Road Synagogue, rabbi in the synagogue departed, left to go to live in Israel, they asked me if I was interested in becoming a rabbi there. Now, I was an extremely young man. I mean, I was only in my early mid-20s.
Which year was that?
This was 1974. So I had come out in 73, and 74 they approached me, and I took up the position at the very beginning of 75. And I probably was too young to realize what I was taking on for myself. But because I'd grown up in a rabbinic home, to some extent, it was a natural part of my understanding of how to function. So I took to it absolutely like a duck to water. Sea Point at that time was the largest Orthodox Jewish congregation in the world. We had a membership of 10,000, with 1,500 in the synagogue on a Sabbath evening. And of course that's relevant to what happened to me, both in terms of my interfaith work and in terms of what happened, if you like, the factors that led to us leaving. Because amongst the congregation were journalists, and my words were covered and very often reported in the press. And they were very often very critical indeed with regards to the political context. In fact, I remember on the eve of the elections that perhaps were in 76, 77, I said anybody that supports the policies of the powers that be betrays is a traitor to their ethical heritage. I remember a couple of people getting up and walking out of my sermon with their wives. I always said I far prefer people to walk out of my sermons than to fall asleep during them. And it was also the period after Soweto riots, and I started, I was invited to speak at protests at the City Hall, at large gatherings. I think there were also about 10,000 people at one of the big protest rallies. I was saying the same thing that I'd been saying in the synagogue, but perhaps I wasn't aware, but for the authorities, it was already something quite different when I was speaking to an interracial audience in a public place. And my phone was tapped. I received death threats. There were death threats against our children and activities such. And in the end, you have to make a decision. We had no idea that within such a brief period of time things would work out as remarkably as they did in South Africa. We were sure we were in for a big bloodbath. And the question was, to what degree do you dedicate your life to South Africa? If I would have been born in South Africa, then maybe I would have felt I had no moral choice. But I wasn't, and I felt there was a big world outside there where they also wanted my services. But in the end, the government made sure of that decision because they didn't renew my visa, and so they sent me packing. But now, then, rewinding a little bit earlier, when I was offered this particular position, Sharon and I decided that we would take it on the understanding that we were going to seek to live a way that was in keeping with the moral values of our religious heritage, which meant that if we employed people, we paid them decent wages, and that we would take a stand against any immoral practices that had any bearing on our lives. And it was important also for me, in terms of my own, if you like, moral integrity, to be known in that regard within my community, and to strive to set an example for my community. But I didn't only want this to be internal, I also wanted it to be in relation to the population at large. In other words, I wanted to engage the wider South African population, I wanted my community to see me engage the wider population, I wanted them to try to be engaged in the wider issues. And at that time, one of the few areas in which you could be involved in interracial activity in the South African context without immediately ending up in jail or being kicked out of the country was actually through religion. Generally speaking, the authorities were a little more cautious in that area. So I came to interfaith relations out of a commitment to social justice. I didn't come because I actually had any perception of the importance of interfaith relations in themselves. I saw this as a vehicle by which we could bring communities across the racial divide, the so-called colour bar, as it was once upon a time referred to get to know one another and to humanize one another, and therefore to contribute to a better society in South Africa. But as I have to tell you the story about how I walked my ways around, but as I got involved in this, I discovered two things. One was that even though I was engaging with pastors and priests and imams, I discovered they were amazingly ignorant about me. They had all kinds of distortion and misconceptions, not just about Jews, but about Judaism and about us, even scriptural texts. And I was amazed. I thought, these are educated people, these religious leaders, surely they would know more about me and my heritage. Especially Christians, who after all are rooted within the Hebrew Bible, and I discovered that the many prejudicial ideas were even worse amongst Christians than amongst anyone else. And at the same time I realized, I was part of the same phenomenon myself. I was amazingly ignorant about Muslims and Christians who I was now interacting with. And it was really exciting to discover who they were and to learn about their world and to be enriched by their insights and their experience. But it was even more pragmatically necessary, because if I want to be understood, and I don't want people to have prejudices against me, then I have to understand others and overcome any prejudices I have in relation to them. So it was an enormously salutary experience, and as I got involved in it, I not only realized it was important to combat prejudice and bigotry, but we share so many fundamental values as people of faith from the family of Abraham. If you really claim that there are certain values you're committed to and you do not work with people who share those values, then surely you betray those values. You have a responsibility to work together for values that you share to be greater than the sum of the different parts. So it now became a moral imperative for me. It also, for me, became something even more in terms of my spiritual journey. Now, everything I've said until now, I think almost all my colleagues within the Orthodox rabbinic community would be able to understand. Now I'm going to say something that I'm not sure they will understand. And that is that as I encountered people of other faith, I had a kind of an epiphany, and not in any dramatic sense, but in an understanding. I had never really reflected on it profoundly, but I'd grown up assuming that my religion was not just right, but was the right way, and therefore everybody else must be to some degree in a certain amount of darkness or limited understanding. And through these encounters, it became obvious to me that if God has created us in all our diversity, and this is the divine will by the very creation itself, then surely there are diverse ways of relating to the divine. And no one religion can encapsulate the totality of the divine. God is more than any one religion. And not to understand that is in a way such to try to limit God, which in fact is almost a heresy. And I can never know the totality of the divine. And in a deep inner way, I can never know a religious experience other than my own. But if we encounter, especially within the biblical tradition, the idea that we encounter God actually through the human encounter, creating the divine image, that there's an element of the divine in the human person, and therefore when we encounter one another in genuine respect, we are in fact having a wider experience of the divine in the world. And especially when I encounter my neighbor, who lives in the sense of the divine as a religious person, I'm counting the divine presence even more. And therefore, interfaith relations is not only a pragmatic means of combating prejudice and bigotry, it's not only a matter of working together for shared values, it is a religious experience. And this, for me, all came out of that in a very short period of time. I had an enormous understanding and sense that this was not just something I needed to do tactically or even strategically, but something that had a value in and of itself. And I was hooked on it. And of course, when I became Chief Rabbi of Ireland after that, and in Ireland, therefore I was actually representative of Judaism to the whole of the society at large. A very small community, but nevertheless a community at that time where religious figures had state status, and therefore was one of the most prestigious rabbinic positions. I had the opportunity and in fact the calling for even greater interfaith engagement, less with Islam, and particularly of course with the Catholic Church. And then when we returned home to Jerusalem, I became more involved also with interfaith relations in the Holy Land, especially there because in the final analysis, the judgment on any society, a key judgment on any society, is how you treat your minorities. People often talk of democracy thinking it's just a matter of majority vote. Democracy is more than majority vote. Democracy is how the different communities are able to coexist in a sense of mutual respect. And within the context, especially of the conflict in the Middle East and conflict in the Holy Land, this kind of work becomes even more important and more critical. Unfortunately, because of the profile I had had in positions, especially in Ireland, so Jewish organisations came along and asked me to represent them in this field. So what I was going to do anyway, they asked me now to do professionally. And in fact, the organisation now, the AJC, American Jewish Committee, is the only Jewish organisation in the world that has a position for international interreligious affairs. So I am the only individual, in fact we lack the resources to deal with the demand that, thank God, is an exponential growth in our times. I mean, when you read the newspapers, you don't have any impression. The only thing that the newspapers give you about religion is the negative. But we've never had so much positive encounter, collaboration and cooperation ever in human history as we have today. So this takes up, that's why I'm traveling 50% of the time, all around the world, and I'm very privileged to be able to do what I did. So anyway, again...
Can we back up and maybe just give us an idea of how the Cape Town Interfaith Forum was established and who were the key figures,
right,
and some of the issues that we dealt with.
Right.
So we go back to 1975, 76.
Yes, about that, 75, 76. So I told you that I wanted to do this out of a commitment to social justice. I've also gone on to say how it became more than that for me, but nevertheless I wanted to do it. There are a couple of other factors that galvanized it. One particular person who played a role, and I can't really now, in advanced years, be absolutely sure as to which event comes before which. But certainly a meeting which was certainly a visit out of the blue to my office in at the Moreira congregation from Father Roger Hickley, was a significant factor. It was a very powerful experience for me. Probably the first time I'd ever had an intimate conversation with a priest.
And what motivated him to seek the meeting?
And I'll tell you, because from his conversation, you'll see, he comes on, he says to me, I want to confess, which was a bit of a paradox because he's the we don't have confession within our in that sense, and he's the priest coming to me. I want to confess the terrible history of Christian persecution of Jews, and that this burden is something for which we have to atone and to establish a new relationship on the basis not only of mutual respect but of love. And I would like to be able to work together with the Jewish community in different ways. And one of the things that we initiated together, he already had a relationship with a member of our congregation in Sea Point, George Gross, who was actually a councillor on the Cape City Council. And one of the initiatives, first initiative he started was a hostel for the homeless in the Cape town, in the Sea Point and into the town city centre area. And we worked together on a cooperative initiative. I can't remember whether there was any Muslim party at that, but it's certainly a Jewish Christian initiative to be able to care for the homeless. But I think he was my, if I recall correctly, he was my pathfinder to pave the way to my meeting with Archbishop Naidu, Bishop Stephen Naidu, who was the Catholic bishop at that time, and Cardinal Owen McCann, who was the cardinal. And I started, because I wanted to establish this interfaith forum, I started hawking my wares around. And I started meeting with individuals, proposing this idea that we have a framework in which the clergy would come together. But the idea would be also that we bring our communities together to get to know one another. And everywhere I went, whether I said, you know, Father, Pastor, Sheikh, because my Muslim interlocutor is Sheikh Abu Bakr Najjar of the Muslim Judicial Council. And the things that bind us together are more important than the things that keep us apart. And all of them agreed, and they were all very supportive. And they, you know, in retrospect, it was surprising nobody had ever initiated anything like that before. It should have taken place a long time before. But there was a very positive response. But I knew that in the South African context, at that time especially, if I didn't have somebody from the Dutch Reformed Church, then its impact was of limited value. I heard about the Dominee downtown in a beautiful white Dutch Reformed church down in the centre of town near Parliament, who was having a dialogue with Catholics. At that time, the only Catholic I knew was Roger Hickley, and I didn't really know much of the difference between one kind of Christian and another kind of Christian. But I then learned a little bit about Afrikaner demonology. And I learned that there were two great fears according to the Afrikaner demonology. One was the Zwart Gevaar, and the other was the Roomse Gevaar. So they were either worried about the blacks or the Catholics. And I thought, if this guy is having dialogue between Dutch Reformed Church and Catholics, maybe he'll dialogue with a Jew too. It's very naive. So I made an appointment, and the guy was gracious enough to receive me. And
Do you remember his name?
I don't remember his name, but I do remember that afterwards, he was the first, but after that there are others like Dr. Landsman, who was actually the moderator of the Dutch Reformed Church. He became part of our initiative and participated. But I don't remember what this Dominie's name was. But I can see him. And I come in and I say the same thing to him, you know, Dominie, the things that bring us together are more important than the things that keep us apart. And to my surprise, he says to me with a very heavy South African accent, to tell you the truth, Rabbi, I cannot agree with you, because the most important thing in my life keeps us apart, my belief in Jesus Christ as my personal Redeemer. You do not share that, Rabbi, and therefore, to tell you the truth, Rabbi, you are going to burn in hell. And it's my duty as a good Christian to save you. So I don't know whether, I think I had a little bit of divine inspiration at that point, because of course I could have easily reacted in a very negative way. But I said, well, Dominie, thank you for your honesty. If you believe it is your duty to try to convert me, then you will have to come to our meetings, because otherwise you are missing an opportunity. And she smiled. He agreed to come along, and he did participate in the beginning, and he was less doctrinaire, less pontificatory, if I can mix my metaphors, and he brought in other people to it, so it was a very salutary experience for me. I had the great support of two major figures within the Jewish community, and it was really important for me that I had them both in. One was the head of the Beth Din of the Rabbinic Ecclesiastical Court in South Africa, in Cape Town, was Rabbi Eugene Dushinsky. And the other was a senior Reform rabbi, Rabbi David Sherman. It would not be surprised for a Reform rabbi to be involved in this. In fact, the Reform movement led interfaith relations long before Orthodoxy got involved. It's almost understood. Orthodoxy tends to be more deeply rooted and therefore tends to be a little more insular, whereas Reform tends to be more outward-looking. You know, many of us would say less rooted in that particular regard. But Rabbi Dushinsky was very, very supportive. Rabbi Dushinsky had this very complex personal history.
He was an Orthodox rabbi.
He was he was the head of the ecclesiastical court. He was the equivalent of Sheikh Abu Bakr Najjar. And he was the most important person here. He was the Orthodox, if you like. We didn't have a position as chief rabbi, but in effect he was the equivalent of the Orthodox chief rabbi. And he had come here as a refugee from Hungary. He'd been persecuted by both communists as well as, of course, the Nazis before, and therefore very, very complex history. But he was a remarkable man. He gave enormous support to this. And all these people I've mentioned played a very significant role, as I've mentioned. There were also another key personality was the Dean of the Cape Town Cathedral, Ted King, who of course was a kingmaker as much as Tutu then comes. He was the kingmaker who brought the Tutu. And they were all remarkable individuals. It was an incredible privilege for me to involve with them. Afterwards, there was also Imam Suleiman, was it, who came in? I think it was Suleiman. But at any rate, Sheikh Abu Bakr Najjar was the key person. Incidentally, a close friendship developed between him and Rabbi Dushinsky, who arranged a visit for him to the Arden Muqaddasa.
It wasn't Imam Basir?
It was Imam Basir. Suleiman, was it Suleiman Basir?
Yeah, Abdurrahman Basir.
Abdurrahman Basir, I don't know why.
He was in the book, an old elderly gentleman.
Yes, it was Imam Basir.
Wonderful
yes.
personality.
And we were able to host individuals who visited. I remember when the chief rabbi of Britain, Rabbi Jacobowitz, visited, we had a gathering together with all the religious heads. And relationships were built up were wonderful. And we managed therefore to develop a program also of visitations to different communities, where we would therefore invite people who come, leaders would come together with members of the community to visit, to hear about
most of
your
meetings were held at various places of worship, or just in
I would say the meeting with the clergy were held maybe at halls associated with places of worship. Their purpose was not to go into the places of worship, but we did use the opportunity to get people to get into places of worship.
Which was much of the major venues? Can you remember any of the venues?
I can remember meeting in the St. George's Hall. I remember the Hall of Murray Road. Yeah. I remember a few meetings at the Herengracht Hotel.
Okay.
I can't remember much more than that.
Right. Do you have any advice now, with your wealth of experience and wisdom for the interfaith movement country?
I would say that there are plenty of vexed and complex issues that we need to address. But first and foremost, any interfaith initiative should address first and foremost the issues that are closest to it. So one is the need to develop understanding, to look at areas where we have similarity and differences in terms of our lifestyle, in terms of our calendar, ways in which we therefore can educate one another about one another. After all, we all have to take a lesson from the Holy Quran, which is the only scriptural text which actually has an injunction for dialogue, and therefore if we have to get to know one another before we can actually do anything effectively together. But there are issues that we need to address together, social, moral, ethical issues in the South African context that relate to South African environment. And religious communities need to be working on those issues together, developing common stands, common statements, common initiatives. When I think that relationship is developed well, then one can turn one's attention, if you like, to international issues. And international issues, inevitably, when anything does, especially with regards to areas where Jews and Muslims are always going to somehow relate to the situation in the Holy Land. And what we, I think, have to develop there is an understanding that if we really care about anyone there, then we've got to support a win-win approach. Any kind of zero-sum game is ultimately zero-zero game. What I mean is, if you say, because I care about Jews, therefore I have to be insensitive to Palestinians, Or if you say, because I care about Palestinian dignity, therefore I don't need to care about Israeli security, in the end you are doing disservice to those precisely who you say you care about. Because you're just contributing to a worse situation, create a vicious cycle, and a zero sum. Things will only improve for Palestinians when Israeli security is protected. Things will only improve for Israel's security when Palestinian dignity is able to flourish. The ramifications of that have got a broader impact globally, but I would say it's very important for interfaith dialogue, wherever it is in the world, to learn about all the different initiatives that take place in Holy Land between Muslims, Christians and Jews, and to support those positive initiatives. But first and foremost, my advice was get to know one another properly, and get to know one another's lifestyle and calendar.
Thank you so much.